It all started with a letter taped to my apartment door, an eviction notice. First, I thought it was a mistake. I've lived in this apartment for 3 years, always paid my rent on time, and had never caused any trouble. So, I grabbed the letter, skimmed through it, and saw that my landlord, Frank, claimed I was 2 months behind on rent. My stomach dropped. I immediately checked my bank statements, and sure enough, I'd paid on time. Confused, I called Frank. "Hey Frank, I got this eviction notice. There must be some mistake. I've paid all my rent." He acted like he had no clue what I was talking about, telling me I needed to handle it before things got serious. Couldn't believe it. Was he trying to scam me? I brushed it off, thinking it was just an error. But as the days passed, I kept getting more notices. The threats became more serious. Late fees were stacking up, and if I didn't pay, I'd be out on the street. I knew something was fishy, but I wasn't sure what to do. Frank had always been a little shady, but I never thought he'd pull something like this. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. But it wasn't just me. When I started asking around, I learned that other tenants had been hit with the same notices. Some of them had already paid up, even though they knew they weren't behind. Frank was running a scam, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I was going to fight back, but I had no idea how deep this mess would go. After hearing from other tenants that they'd been receiving similar eviction notices, I knew something wasn't right. Frank wasn't just targeting me, he was going after the entire building. I sat down with my neighbor, Sarah, who had been living in her unit for over 10 years. She was furious. "Frank's been pulling this on everyone," she said, shaking her head. "But most people just pay because they're scared of getting kicked out." That's when I realized it was a full-blown scam. Frank was banking on people being too afraid to fight back, especially those who couldn't afford a lawyer or didn't know their rights. Sarah and I started digging into our leases, looking for any loopholes or details that Frank might have been exploiting. We quickly found out that he wasn't just making baseless claims. He was manipulating records, altering documents to make it look like people hadn't paid their rent. It was worse than I thought. I knew I couldn't tackle this alone. I reached out to a few more neighbors, trying to gather a group of tenants who were willing to stand up to Frank. Some were hesitant, not wanting to risk their homes, but others were fed up. We started comparing notes, and the pattern became clear. Frank was using these phony eviction notices to collect extra money. He'd charge people late fees or claim they missed payments, and then pocket the cash. But that wasn't the only thing we found out. Sarah mentioned hearing rumors about Frank's past. Rumors that suggested this wasn't his first time pulling a scam like this. I knew we needed more evidence to take him down, but time was running out. If we didn't act fast, we'd all be out on the street. It was time to dig deeper and expose Frank for the fraud he was. Now that we knew Frank was up to no good, the next step was to gather hard evidence. It wasn't enough to suspect a scam, we needed proof. Sarah and I decided to comb through old rent receipts, emails, and notices from the landlord. I went through every document I could find, and sure enough, there were discrepancies. Dates didn't line up, rent payments were recorded as late when they weren't, and some notices appeared to be backdated. It was clear that Frank had been playing this game for a while. But what really got me was when I found a letter he had sent to me months ago, claiming I owed an additional maintenance fee for repairs I never even heard about. I brushed it off back then, thinking it was some kind of administrative error. Now I knew better. This was part of Frank's scheme to squeeze extra money out of tenants who didn't ask questions. The more I dug, the angrier I got. Sarah and I pooled our evidence, and then we went to our other neighbors. Once they saw what we had found, more people started coming forward with their own stories. Some had paid these bogus fees just to avoid trouble, while others had been threatened with eviction if they didn't comply. One neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Higgins, had been forced to pay hundreds in late fees that weren't even real. The poor guy didn't even know how to check his bank statements online, so he had no idea he was being scammed. It was heartbreaking to see how Frank was taking advantage of vulnerable people like him. At this point, I knew we had enough evidence to blow the lid off Frank's operation. But I wasn't just going to report him and hope for the best. No, we had to hit him where it hurt and make sure he couldn't just walk away from this. It was time to go public. With all the evidence we had gathered, it was time to take action. Sarah and I knew that reporting Frank to the authorities was one step, but we also needed to make sure the whole neighborhood knew what was happening. If we kept it quiet, Frank might just weasel his way out of trouble like he probably had in the past. So we decided to go public and expose him. I started by creating a detailed post on our neighborhood's online forum, explaining what we had uncovered. I listed the fake fees, the eviction threats, and all the shady tactics Frank had been using for months, maybe even years. I attached copies of the documents we found so no one could doubt our claims. The response was explosive. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from tenants, all sharing their own horror stories about Frank. But it didn't stop there. Someone from the local news station saw the post and reached out to me. They were interested in doing a story about predatory landlords, and our situation was exactly what they were looking for. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to bring more attention to myself, but after talking it over with Sarah, I knew it was the right move. Frank wasn't just screwing us over, he was hurting the entire community, and people deserved to know. The news station sent a reporter over the next day. I sat down with them and laid everything out. They even interviewed some of the other tenants who had been affected by Frank's scams. When the story aired, it hit Frank hard. Suddenly, everyone knew what kind of landlord he really was, and he couldn't hide behind his fake notices or legal threats anymore. But what we didn't expect was the attention from city officials. After the news story aired, a representative from the city's housing authority reached out to me. Apparently, this wasn't the first time they'd heard complaints about Frank. I was about to find out just how deep his corruption really went. After the news story aired, things escalated quickly. The housing authority wasted no time getting involved. They had been keeping an eye on landlords like Frank for a while, but our public exposure gave them the perfect reason to start digging deeper into his practices. Turns out, we weren't the first tenants to be screwed over by him, just the loudest. A city investigator contacted me to get more details. I handed over all the evidence we had collected, photos, letters, even a recording of Frank making shady verbal agreements with one of my neighbors. The investigator was impressed, saying it was more than enough to launch a full investigation into Frank's dealings. Apparently, his tactics went beyond just our building. He had a reputation for exploiting tenants all over the city, but most people were too scared to push back. The investigator thanked me for bringing everything to light and promised to follow up soon. While all this was going on, Frank wasn't staying quiet. He had lawyered up and was still trying to play tough, sending more threatening letters and even attempting to raise my rent out of nowhere. But I wasn't backing down, not after everything we had already gone through. Besides, now I had the city behind me. One of the best moments was when I ran into Frank in the hallway a few days later. His usual smugness was gone, replaced with frustration and anger. He knew his little game was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He tried to intimidate me, but it was too late for that. I just smiled and told him, "See you in court, Frank." It felt like the tide was turning in my favor, but the real victory was still to come. Because as the city's investigation went deeper, they uncovered something even bigger. A full-blown scam that Frank had been running for years. And this time he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. The city investigator called me with an update a few weeks later, and what he told me blew my mind. Frank wasn't just skimming rent or squeezing tenants with shady fees. No, this guy was running a full-scale rental scam that went way deeper than any of us could have imagined. Turns out, Frank had been falsifying documents and using fake companies to pocket city subsidies meant for low-income housing. He had registered several of his buildings as affordable housing to get government payouts, but in reality, none of his properties qualified. The worst part? He'd been collecting these subsidies for years, raking in tens of thousands of dollars while his tenants lived in squalor, paying full market rent for places that should have been better maintained. The housing authority was livid. They immediately froze all of Frank's assets and sent auditors to go through every piece of paperwork tied to his properties. Not only had he been scamming the city, but he'd also forged signatures, doctored maintenance records, and lied about inspection results. It was a full-blown disaster for him, and I was thrilled to watch it unfold. While the city was digging deeper, Frank's lawyer reached out to me, trying to offer a settlement. They knew the game was up and wanted to make it go away quickly. They proposed dropping all the eviction threats, paying me a sum of money, and even offering me a reduced rent in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. But I wasn't about to let Frank off the hook that easily. I turned the offer down flat. The media caught wind of the investigation, too. With more details emerging about Frank's scam, reporters started swarming the building, eager to interview tenants. Suddenly, Frank was getting the kind of attention he couldn't buy his way out of. His reputation was crumbling, and the scandal was only growing. But as much as I enjoyed watching him squirm, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. The legal battle was just beginning, and I wasn't stopping until Frank got what he deserved. With Frank's scam exposed and the media digging into his dirty dealings, the whole building felt like it was on edge. Tenants who had been silent before were suddenly coming out of the woodwork, sharing their horror stories of dealing with Frank. Overcharged rent, ignored repairs, random threats of eviction. It seemed like everyone had a story. I decided to rally the tenants together. If we all stood united, we could push back harder against Frank's remaining legal tricks and ensure he couldn't just wiggle out of this mess by settling with individuals one by one. I started going door to door, talking to everyone and encouraging them to join forces. The more tenants who banded together, the stronger our case would be. At first, some people were hesitant. They were scared of retaliation or thought it wasn't worth the trouble. But as the details of Frank's scam became public, people's attitudes began to shift. When they realized that Frank had been scamming not just them but the city itself, they got mad. And when they got mad, they got motivated. Soon, we had a group of tenants who were ready to fight. We held meetings in the building's lobby, sharing information and working with a lawyer to file a class action lawsuit against Frank. The lawyer explained that, given the extent of the fraud, we had a solid case. Not only to get compensation for the rent and fees we'd overpaid, but also to make sure Frank would never be able to do this to anyone else again. Meanwhile, the media frenzy continued to grow. Reporters were covering the story every day, and our building became a symbol of tenants standing up to corrupt landlords. The more attention we got, the more support we received, not just from tenants in our building but from others in the neighborhood and across the city who had dealt with similar situations. It felt like we were part of something bigger, a movement to take back our rights. But while things were looking up for us, Frank wasn't backing down without a fight. His lawyer was still trying to cut deals behind the scenes, offering quick payouts to tenants who were willing to drop out of the lawsuit. And, of course, there were rumors that Frank had a few dirty tricks left up his sleeve. The tension was rising, but for the first time it felt like we had the upper hand. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for every tenant who had been taken advantage of. And we weren't going to stop until justice was served. Just when it seemed like things were finally turning in our favor, Frank played one of his dirty tricks. We were getting ready to file the class action lawsuit, and the media attention was at an all-time high. Then, out of nowhere, I started hearing rumors that some of the tenants who had joined our fight were backing out. First, I didn't believe it. We'd come so far, and we were so close to bringing Frank down. Why would anyone quit now? But sure enough, one by one, tenants started dropping out. Some stopped showing up to meetings. Others stopped responding to calls and texts. It felt like our group was falling apart just when we needed to be the strongest. I knew something was up. This wasn't just people losing interest or getting cold feet. Frank had to be involved somehow. It didn't take long to figure out what was going on. Frank's lawyer had been quietly approaching tenants, offering them quick settlements under the table. He was giving them just enough money to walk away from the lawsuit, hoping that if enough people took the deal, the class action would fall apart. It was sneaky, but it was exactly the kind of move I'd come to expect from Frank. Some tenants, understandably, took the money. They were tired of fighting, and the offer was tempting. It was quick cash, no more meetings, no more stress. Others, though, held strong. They saw through the ploy and knew that taking Frank's money wouldn't fix the bigger problem. We needed to stick together if we wanted real justice. But it wasn't just the bribes that were a problem. Frank also started pulling other shady moves, like suddenly fixing the building's long-neglected problems. Repairs that had been ignored for months were magically getting done, and tenants who had been vocal about the issues were finding their requests suddenly fulfilled. It was clear Frank was trying to buy people's silence with repairs and hush money. The more this went on, the more frustrated I got. It felt like Frank was trying to tear down everything we'd built, bit by bit. But I wasn't going to let him win. The core group of us who had stuck together knew we had a strong case, and we weren't backing down. If anything, Frank's desperate tactics only proved that he was scared, and that we were on the right track. I doubled down on rallying the tenants who were still with us. We kept meeting, kept organizing, and kept collecting evidence. We weren't just going to beat Frank. We were going to make sure he never got away with this again. But as the lawsuit moved closer to being filed, it became clear that this fight was far from over. Frank still had cards to play, and I knew that he wasn't done trying to sabotage our efforts. We had to be ready for whatever came next. Things were heating up. After Frank's failed attempt to bribe tenants into dropping out of the lawsuit, our group felt more determined than ever. We were still gathering evidence, still organizing, and still planning to file the lawsuit that would take Frank down. But just when we thought we'd seen it all, something unexpected happened. One morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was early, too early for any of the usual maintenance guys or delivery people. I opened the door to find a man standing there, holding a clipboard. He looked official, like some sort of inspector, but I hadn't been notified about any scheduled inspections. My first thought was that Frank was pulling some new move to intimidate us into backing off. "Morning. I'm here to inspect your unit for health and safety issues," the man said, flashing a badge that looked more like a generic ID than something official. I stared at him for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. "Health and safety?" I repeated, confused. I wasn't informed about any inspection, and I haven't had any issues. The man didn't seem fazed by my questions. He just kept pushing. "We're doing routine inspections on all units. It's just a formality. It'll only take a minute." I wasn't convinced. Something about this felt off. Was this really a health inspection? Or was it just another of Frank's tactics to harass us and build his case for eviction? I told him I wasn't comfortable letting him in without any prior notice. That's when he gave me a small, knowing smile and said, "It's in your lease agreement. You've got to let us in for inspections. Just for maintenance purposes." That's when it clicked. Frank was behind this. He had probably sent the so-called inspector to get a glimpse of my apartment, looking for any reason to claim that I wasn't following the lease terms and give him an excuse for eviction. I wasn't about to let him get away with it. "I'm sorry, but I'm not letting anyone in without proper notice. I know my rights." The man didn't argue. He just shrugged and left, but not before saying, "You'll regret this." I had a bad feeling about this whole situation, but now I was more determined than ever. Frank was resorting to underhanded tactics. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The fight was only getting started. After the fake inspection incident, I knew I had to be more careful. Frank wasn't just trying to force me out through eviction. He was playing a bigger game, one that involved exploiting the entire building for personal gain. As I dug deeper, I started piecing together a bigger picture. A scam that went beyond just me. I began talking to other tenants, asking around about the building's history, the repairs or lack thereof, and any strange dealings they'd noticed. It wasn't long before I found out Frank wasn't just your average landlord. He had a history of buying up rundown properties on the cheap, making minimal repairs, and then jacking up the rent to prices that were way beyond what the units were worth. What I didn't realize at first was that he wasn't just exploiting the building. He was systematically forcing out tenants who refused to pay the inflated rent. He would give them notice of eviction for petty reasons like too much noise or not maintaining the apartment well, even when no violations existed. Once the tenant was gone, he'd either raise the rent again or sell the property to the highest bidder. The more I found out, the more I was shocked by his tactics. Frank was making a fortune off of taking advantage of people who couldn't afford to fight back. And I was next on his list. As I continued talking to other tenants, one of them, Carla, let slip that Frank had been trying to force out a few more people in our building. She had even overheard him bragging about it. "Once the place is empty, I can sell it for 3 times what it's worth," Frank had said. It was clear now. I wasn't just a target in a petty landlord-tenant dispute. Frank had turned this building into his personal cash cow, and anyone who stood in his way was disposable. I started organizing. I wasn't going to be another tenant Frank could push around. I contacted a few more tenants, the ones who weren't as intimidated by Frank's games, and we began discussing the best way to protect ourselves. It was time for a fight. I wasn't just going to expose Frank for trying to evict me. I was going to expose his entire scam. That I knew I needed more than just a group of tenants complaining. If we were going to stand up to Frank, we needed a plan. I contacted a local tenant rights lawyer to get some legal advice, and we began organizing all the evidence we had. I had already started gathering the notices of eviction, the bogus inspection reports, and any communication from Frank. But now I had to get my hands on something that would really put him in a tough spot. I asked the tenants around me if anyone had kept a record of the rent hikes, any notices about the building's condition, or other legal notices. One by one, people began pulling together their documents. Some had screenshots of emails where Frank threatened to evict them if they didn't accept the new rent hikes. Others had photos showing the awful conditions in the building and how it had been getting worse over the years. But the real game changer came when Carla came to me with a stack of old lease agreements. She had worked in the leasing office for a short time and managed to keep a few documents when she left. These documents proved something huge. Frank had been charging tenants for repairs that were never made. Not only that, but some of the agreements had been altered after the tenants had signed them. This wasn't just a case of bad management or neglect. This was fraud. Armed with this information, we decided to take the next step. We filed a formal complaint with the housing authority, claiming not only wrongful eviction attempts but also fraud and misrepresentation. The lawyer helped us put together a case that would force Frank to stop his illegal practices. We didn't just want to stop him from evicting me, we wanted him held accountable for the scam he had been running. The pressure started building. Frank was getting wind of what we were doing, and he didn't like it one bit. The intimidation started again. More threats of eviction, calls to the tenants who had joined us, and even a few shady attempts to pressure people into withdrawing their complaints. But by now, the group was stronger than ever. Everyone was in it together. What Frank didn't realize was that this wasn't just about one apartment anymore. We were a team, and the more he tried to push us, the stronger our resolve became. It was only a matter of time before we brought him down. Things started getting really tense. Frank wasn't backing down, and he began using every dirty tactic he could think of to try and scare us into dropping the case. He threatened tenants with fines, increased rent, and even got the building manager to send out letters saying that, if anyone continued to cause trouble, they would be evicted for the good of the building's safety. Classic intimidation, and honestly, it pissed us off more than ever. But we had the legal team on our side, and we had one huge advantage: Frank's own incompetence. The more he tried to throw us off track, the more mistakes he made. For example, one day, he sent out a notice with a correction to our leases, stating that our rent had increased, but the dates were all wrong. The legal language was vague, and the new terms contradicted the original agreements we had all signed. This was a golden opportunity. I immediately forwarded the notice to my lawyer, and he was furious. This was blatant fraud. The lease agreement had already been altered once, and now Frank was trying to sneak through another change. My lawyer advised us to file an immediate complaint with the city and go public with the issue. We were going to expose Frank's scam once and for all. But before we did that, I decided to confront him directly. I'd had enough of his shady dealings, and it was time to call him out. Armed with the evidence, I made my way to his office. He wasn't expecting it, and when I walked in, I could see the panic in his eyes. He was used to tenants being afraid of him, used to them backing down. But this time was different. "Frank," I said, laying out all the documents on his desk, "you've been running a scam for years, and you're not getting away with it anymore. We've got everything: photos, emails, fake leases, and the legal team to back it all up. If you don't fix this immediately, I'll make sure the whole city knows exactly what you've been up to." At first, he tried to deny everything. He claimed he was just following standard procedures, and that we were all misinterpreting the situation. But I wasn't buying it, and he could tell. His arrogance started to slip, and I knew I had him right where I wanted him. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and back-and-forth emails with the housing authority. But something shifted in Frank's attitude. He knew the game was up. When he called me to discuss things, he offered a settlement. He wanted to avoid going public with the whole ordeal, but he was willing to offer us a deal to keep everything quiet. I wasn't about to let him get off that easy. We were all in this together, and we weren't going to settle for anything less than justice. It was time to put the final nail in the coffin that I knew we couldn't back down now. The settlement offer was just a last-ditch attempt to cover up the mess he had created. But we had a plan to go public with everything, to expose his scam for all to see. My lawyer and I discussed the best strategy, and we agreed that the best way to hit him hard was by contacting local media. If we went public, Frank's reputation would be ruined, and we'd have a lot more leverage. We gathered all our evidence, emails, fake notices, the misleading leases, and started reaching out to reporters who had covered housing issues in the city before. It didn't take long before we had a meeting set up with a local investigative journalist who was known for exposing corrupt landlords. They were eager to cover the story, and we gave them everything they needed to get started. While all of this was happening, I kept in touch with the other tenants. Everyone was furious with Frank, but they were also scared. Some were still worried about retaliation, but I kept assuring them that we were in this together. We were no longer just individual tenants. We were a group united against a scam artist. We were strong. The journalist who was covering the story did some digging of her own. She found more evidence of Frank's past scams, old lawsuits from previous tenants, shady financial transactions, and even a few more whistleblowers who had been too afraid to speak up until now. Frank's entire operation was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before the media picked up on it. The day the article came out, it felt like the world had shifted. The headline read, "Local landlord exposed for running shady scheme to evict tenants and inflate rent." The story detailed everything Frank had been doing to us, including the false lease changes, the fake notices, and his attempts to intimidate us into backing down. It was all there for the world to see. The fallout was immediate. The housing authority launched a full investigation into Frank's practices, and tenants across the building started getting calls about possible compensation for the illegal rent hikes. Even the city council stepped in, promising stricter regulations for landlords like Frank. But the best part? Frank's business started to unravel. Tenants began leaving in droves, refusing to stay in his buildings anymore. Word spread quickly about his scam, and potential renters started looking elsewhere. Frank tried to salvage his reputation by offering discounts and making public apologies, but it was too little, too late. The damage was done. Meanwhile, the tenants who had fought back, including me, were finally able to breathe a little easier. We had won. Not only had we exposed Frank's scam, but we had also stood up for ourselves in a way that sent a message to other landlords. You can't take advantage of people without facing the consequences. In the end, Frank had to sell his buildings at a huge loss. The city imposed heavy fines, and his reputation was destroyed. As for the tenants, we moved on, but we'd never forget how we came together to take down a landlord who thought he could get away with anything. And me? I learned that sometimes the best thing you can do when faced with injustice is stand your ground. You never know when you'll be the one to expose a scam and make a real difference.